All right, you guys ready for a really deep dive? This was a lot of fun, and I really have to admit that there's a big personal interest in me answering this question because I personally do supplement with melatonin. So Michael asked, can you discuss the role of melatonin as an antioxidant and the possible benefits versus risks of it as an oral antioxidant supplement? And this is I thought this was a really interesting question because most people, when they ask about melatonin, they talk about it in the context of sleep, like how melatonin can improve sleep. Does it improve sleep? And not a lot of people are aware that melatonin is actually it is a very powerful antioxidant, but not in the same way as vitamin E or vitamin E is. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Generally speaking, just overall summary, melatonin does have a pretty strong antioxidant effect, and there's studies showing that even can be protective against radiation. At least some very small studies with cancer patients undergoing radiochemotherapy. However, we did discuss back in Q&A number 44 that this balance between oxidation and reduction is very important. And so we're going to talk about this as we go into a little bit deeper of a dive, but I just kind of want to give you guys an overview. And then, of course, melatonin can affect some aspects of sleep, so we'll get into that as well. All right, so in studies where melatonin doses were up to 20 milligrams a day, which is definitely on the very high end of the dose range for several months, it's been shown to be safe with very rare mild adverse effects. And really the biggest adverse effects with people taking 20 milligrams of melatonin a day for several months is grogginess in the morning, sleepiness, maybe a headache, or feeling like cold. So melatonin also plays a role in regulating body temperature. So it does sort of lower core body temperature. So that's another sort of weird side effect that could be quote unquote adverse to some people with, very high doses of melatonin supplementation. There's really no evidence that my team and I could find that taking melatonin as a supplement can affect your endogenous production of melatonin. So melatonin is a hormone produced in the pineal gland. When I say it's a hormone, it's affecting other tissues, and it's regulating, the activation and deactivation of a variety of genes. And so it's affecting a lot of biological processes, not just sleep. But there's really no evidence that taking melatonin, at least, in terms of the longer studies that have been done, affects a person's capacity to make their own melatonin. So that has not been observed yet. There's been a few animal studies with extremely high doses. I mean, we're talking just supraphysiological, well over the 20 milligrams of the melatonin, which is already a high dose, that has shown the melatonin receptor, what's called desensitization. So in other words, the receptors are less sensitive to the melatonin hormone. But again, human studies have not shown that prolonged use of melatonin causes tolerance. So people don't, when they're taking melatonin, it doesn't cause them to need a higher and higher dose, which would be indicative of receptor desensitization, but that's just not the case, which I find very encouraging. Of course, there's all sorts of interactions with melatonin and other drugs that are important to consider, which we'll dive a little bit into. But I want to talk a little bit about its antioxidant activity. It's interesting because melatonin is also what's called lipophilic, like vitamin E. And so it has antioxidant activity in the cell membranes. And it also is activating glutathione, which is lipophilic as well. So it has direct and indirect antioxidant activity. It's activating a variety of important stress response antioxidant genes. So this has been shown actually in a variety of randomized controlled trials. Melatonin increases our endogenous production of glutathione, superoxide dismutase, a variety of different glutathione enzymes like glutathione peroxidase, glutathione reductase. Like these are really important antioxidant enzymes. It activates the NRF2 pathway. So this is the same pathway that sulforaphane activates as well. It's been shown in human studies to reduce biomarkers of lipid peroxidation. So that's like, that LDL and stuff that gets oxidized. So lipid peroxidations reduce protein carbonyl. So that's proteins being oxidized, which plays a role in just, proteins not working as well. It also plays a role in protein aggregation. So there's a lot of evidence that even taking higher doses, in fact, have a more pronounced antioxidant effect in human studies that really suggests melatonin definitely has a very strong antioxidant effect in humans. And it's also got an indirect action. So, so this is kind of the indirect where it's activating the genetic pathways, but it's also activating the melatonin 1 and melatonin 2 receptors. And that's how it's activating all those pathways. So that's the indirect antioxidant activity. The direct action is actually melatonin itself being able to react with reactive oxygen species. So the structure of melatonin itself, it's this aromatic indole, which just that structure itself sort of helps buffer some of the reactive oxygen species. So it can, in some ways, act a little bit as a direct antioxidant like vitamin C can, like vitamin E can. But I would say the major way that it's an antioxidant is its indirect action by actually just activating through these, the melatonin 1 and melatonin receptors, activating all these different antioxidant genes that we have. So you might think, oh, wow, well, it's reducing all this oxidative stress. That's great. And it is. But, as with anything, you always want to balance, right? And while a lot of people are familiar with oxidative stress and how it's not good to have a lot of it because you get oxidized lipids and proteins and you can get DNA damage and mitochondrial damage and all that. When you have too much of the other side, the antioxidant effect, you can have what's called reductive stress. And it's equally important to not go too overboard with that reductive stress. Unfortunately, there's no really easy way to measure this in humans. And it's not even really, there's a lot of technical and I would say protocol problems, even just doing it in animal studies as well. Do you have to measure like the NAD to NADH ratio rather than just measuring like NAD levels, right? So a lot of people are interested in these precursors to NAD or NAD boosters like nicotinamide riboside, nicotinamide mononucleotide. And you'll find human studies where, NAD is directly measured. It's a lot easier to just measure NAD, but when you're looking just like for that ratio of NAD to NADH, it's much more finicky and it's really difficult to measure that sort of balance. And so until we have more sensitive assays, I don't know that we're going to have a direct measurement of reductive stress. And everything I'm talking about with, well, how do you know if you're getting, too much or you're, having this type of reductive stress? It's all sort of speculation at this point. There's no evidence that it's occurring in people that are taking, let's say, 20 milligrams of melatonin a day, because we don't really know how much of this oxidative stress is even going on. And there's probably a very an age-dependent, lifestyle-dependent as well mechanism. I mean, the more oxidative stress you have, the more you need to counter it as well. So it's just one of those things where you kind of want to be a little bit cautious, where you don't want to go overboard on the antioxidants either. Now, the question also, there was a bit of a hint of radio protection. So there's been a lot of animal studies that show melatonin can help protect against ionizing radiation. So that's like causing DNA damage and all sorts of problems. There's a few randomized controlled trials that have found melatonin supplementation can actually mitigate some of the side effects associated with radiochemotherapy in cancer patients. So it reduced fatigue. So there's a meta-analysis that combined a variety of randomized controlled trials together, and it reduced the relative risk of fatigue by about 63%. It reduced neurotoxicity by 81%. Now to me, that's pretty intriguing. And then it reduced a variety of effects on blood cells as well. So thrombocytopenia, and again, it seemed to have a little bit of a protective effect on, just blood cells in general. So that's super interesting. Not a lot of people digging up in those studies, those old studies, but again, there's not a ton of evidence out there. This is just looking at what there actually is. There's not a lot of people studying this. That's the problem, right? There's also been some interest in the effect on blood pressure. So there's been several different, again, meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials and looking at melatonin supplementation on blood pressure. And there does seem to be a general blood pressure reduction. So there's 5 different randomized controlled trials that found melatonin supplementation anywhere between 3 to 10 milligrams a day caused a significant decrease in blood pressure. So systolic blood pressure on average was about 3.5 millimeters of mercury lower, and then diastolic blood pressure was about 3 or so millimeters of mercury lower. There's also an effect on nocturnal blood pressure. So there's been other studies looking at, during nighttime, your blood pressure changes. So it was found that taking a controlled release of melatonin, about 2 to 3 milligrams a day, lowered the systolic blood pressure by about 6 milligrams of mercury and diastolic by 3.5. So this was a little bit even higher than just general blood pressure. And then there's other studies that have looked at like people with metabolic syndrome, and it seemed as though there was really substantial blood pressure reductions in people with metabolic syndrome in a couple of studies with melatonin supplementation. So again, very interesting that melatonin is affecting blood pressure as well. And then there's a variety of other just general health, aspects that have been looked at with randomized controlled trials. So things like surgical outcomes. Interestingly, anxiety is reduced. It was lower in people that were taking melatonin versus a placebo. Pregnancy. So it seems to there's like some, a few studies looking at the effect of melatonin on fertility, and it seems that it improves mature oocytes. It seems to improve embryo quality, and it's probably linked to its antioxidant activity, if I were to guess, but it's not really known exactly why melatonin's, improving some fertility aspects. There's been some mixed, I would say, results with metabolic disease. I talked about blood pressure, but melatonin does affect insulin release, and so it's one of the reasons why eating late at night is not such a great idea. So you don't like taking a lot of melatonin and then eating a meal probably is not a good idea. Again, we mentioned that we talked a little bit about cancer, and it seems as though it seems to help with, particularly with radiochemotherapy. There's been a meta-analysis looking at that. Remission of cancer has been shown to be improved. And then survival at 1 year is also improved. And again, we need more studies to really make a pretty, I would say, a conclusive statement, but it's interesting nonetheless. And then again, with the adverse effects, the most frequent is just, grogginess, daytime sleepiness, sometimes headaches, and then hypothermia is another one. There's a few serious, side effects that can happen in some people, but it's really kind of not very common. Looking at high dose, so anywhere between 20 to 25 milligrams of melatonin a day, a meta-analysis of several different randomized controlled trials found that in adults over the age of 30 years old that took that high dose for 6 months, really there wasn't any, detectable adverse effects or withdrawals or, anything like that. So children and adolescents is a little different. I mean, it's unclear, if melatonin is going to affect puberty or hormonal, like, systems and stuff. And so obviously, like, that would be a different, a much more cautious situation. Adults at the age of 40 is when they start to make less melatonin just endogenously. That's kind of when it starts to really sort of precipitously start to go down. And then as you get older, 50s and 60s, it really goes down. So, most children and adolescents, if they don't have some sort of weird genetic problem, shouldn't really have much of a need to take melatonin. And then I mentioned drug interactions. I would say that's the concern would be to obviously speak with your physician if you're considering supplementing, because it can interact with a variety of different prescriptive drugs, like, for example, blood thinners and others. So that's obviously something to keep in mind as well. But other than that, I mentioned the endogenous production. It doesn't seem to really, supplementation with melatonin doesn't really seem to affect people's endogenous production of it, at least in the clinical studies that have been done. A couple of months later, people are still making the same normal amount of melatonin after taking melatonin for several months and then stopping. So, the receptor desensitization, while I think a lot of the fear of the melatonin has come from a couple of in vitro studies where you dump melatonin on cells in a petri dish, and that affects it, but that's really not relevant. And then also, like, a couple of, again, animal studies that are like just not even, the dose is not even translatable to humans, that have shown a little bit of desensitization, but like there hasn't been any human studies that have shown evidence of that. Again, like I said, most people, they don't show a need to actually have to increase their melatonin dose as they continue taking it, which is what you would expect to happen if there was desensitization occurring. So that's kind of the roundup of melatonin. I continue to be really interested in it, and like I said, I do actually supplement with melatonin as well. But my biggest concern, again, would be the reductive stress. I take it at night, like most people would. So I mean, you're less likely to have that blunting effect of exercise, which is always a concern as well. But so far I'm not buying into the fear that melatonin supplementation is really bad. Matt Miller's asking in the chat how much melatonin I supplement with, and if I'm concerned about claims that melatonin supplements contain up to 400% more than advertised. I mean, that's always a concern. So my go-to always is Consumer Lab, because they do a lot of that third-party testing, and they do measure the amounts, the concentrations of the active, ingredient that's supposed to be in there. So there's always a concern if you're just randomly buying a melatonin supplement off Amazon, for example, that you may be getting a melatonin dose dramatically higher or dramatically lower than what you think you're getting, or you may also be getting something else mixed with it. So that, I mean, generally speaking, yes, I think that's a concern with most supplements. And so it's important to verify. I take pure encapsulations. I was taking quite a high dose of 20 milligrams, and then now I'm dropping down to 10, which is still high. But I've been going back and forth between that, mostly because I think I just had a lot of the 20, and I was specifically taking it because it seemed to resolve any night terrors that I can get sometimes. And that seems to be the case with like a higher dose. But I do think I like the 10 milligrams dose better than the 20 with respect to like not being groggy when I wake up. So I think there's a little bit of personal preference in there as well. But so that's kind of my dose. James is asking in the chat, yes, my night terrors, like the melatonin really seems to, like, my night terrors mostly happen when I'm really stressed. And but even if I'm stressed, melatonin seems to help with that. And so it's interesting, and I wonder if there is a neuroprotective effect going on in my brain where the stress is causing like this oxidative stress, and that's like somehow linked to my night terrors that I sometimes get, and melatonin kind of helps because it's not like dramatically affecting my sleep. I mean, it does affect my sleep latency, so I do fall asleep a little bit earlier than I otherwise would without it. but not much. So it's doing something with my brain during sleep. And again, I think that it is a neuroprotective supplement. And I don't know that there's so far I'm not convinced there's a lot of evidence that it's like really bad for you.